So we will now hear Marcela Delgado in her second year PhD. She's from the Media and Design Laboratory, and she will tell us about virtual entanglements tracing the human-nature dichotomy.
Okay, well, thank you to the organ. Oh, I have to do this one. Okay. Well, thank you to the organizers of this event and to the discussants for sharing your time and valuable feedback. Given the upward trend in urbanization, the alarming decline in global biodiversity, it is vital to design for urban growth that supports all life forms. The anthropocentric bias ingrained in the way we sense and view the city, however, inhibits the development of future imaginaries aimed at multi-species coexistence. This thesis aims to recalibrate the lens with which we approach future habitat integration in the design disciplines by questioning the conceptual frameworks with which urban sensing and visualization is approached, the imaginaries it amplifies and those it overlooks. How can visualization, simulation, and prediction tools be utilized to transcend the nature-culture divide and generate multi-species resolutions of the city? This descriptive research is organized in 3 sections that aim to first uncover the nature-culture divide as reflected in urban species data collection and visualization methods. Secondly, challenge this construct by exploring how certain data assemblages express interconnectedness with the built environment. And lastly, model synergistic relationships between human and non-human flows through the use of visualization, simulation, and prediction tools. Lausanne will serve as the case study for this investigation, given that these final scenarios will be tested in the context of the Blue City, an Innosuit's flagship project that proposes a digital twin of Lausanne. This presentation is intended to lay out the questions that are guiding the development of the first section of the research. These questions include, what agents, methods, and instruments bring urban biodiversity into our field of vision? What are the translations and transformations necessary for computing the living? And when does the process of fixing species into immutable data become a generative act capable of describing spaces of overlap between modes of being? How does architecture and infrastructure intersect with biodiversity and participate in conceptualizing the environment as other, such as nature to be protected, attracted, or nature to be repelled, controlled, or eliminated? Given that multiple actors participate in constructing the urban imaginary, these questions will be described through the study of official and unofficial data sets, cultural events, media coverage, citizen science platforms, and published scientific findings. In the context of posthumanism, design's focus on the individual has been irreversibly challenged, and the work of decentering the human experience as the touchstone of design praxis requires looking outside of disciplinary boundaries. The ways in which non-human species navigate and thrive in urban landscapes, though largely underrepresented in design research and practice, has also been historically overlooked by naturalists and biologists who have only recently begun to take interest in the city. This convergence in disciplinary attention provides fertile ground for investigating new forms of thought that step away from conventional modernist dichotomies that treat the urban environment as a collection of independent structures and green islands rather than as an interdependent ecology. In the words of writer-artist James Bridle, we're accustomed largely by scientific practice to taking things apart, separating them into their component attributes, fixing them for study, and piece by piece reducing their collective agency until they have none at all. But this is the opposite of ecology, which seeks to find connections between all things and resolve them into greater interconnected systems. Biodiversity is radically inclusive and spans multiple ways of being and interdependencies that can overwhelm our narrow and limited perception. To capture this complexity and mold these realities into knowable forms, reduction and abstraction is inevitable and necessary. But I'd like to remain vigilant of this tendency and formulate methods that abstract the ties between objects, technologies, cities, and living things, and be wary of abstraction that observes individual components untethered from context and larger meaning. Media and technology should expand and augment our perception of these connections, but also state unknowns and uncertainties where they are present. Trees, for instance, are easy to count because they're largely visible. They stand still, at least from our vantage point, and they're easily sensed by satellite technology. A tree is planted, CO2 is captured, a tree is uprooted. But if we limit our understanding of urban biodiversity to what is visible and easily computed, then whole ecologies are erased from our urban imaginary. I'd like to propose a framework that I call points, planes, and proxies, tied to abstractions that support our knowing, such as raw observation, sightings, inventories of biodiversity towards highly interlinked, meaningful relationships between species and the design environment that are suggested or made explicit. At times, these modes and levels of abstraction can reinforce dichotomies, and at other times, their combination can register synergies. For example, these data points scraped from a naturalist site represent Lausanne's biodiversity through three pieces of data: a picture of an individual species taken by a citizen scientist, the geolocation of where that picture was taken, and the category of species represented by the color of a point. This spatial distribution of points are not yet operational because they do not express a relationship to urban space or architecture. Planes, on the other hand, can be overlaid like tracing paper. An intersection with the built environment can be detected. In 2014, the Bureau d'études de biologie Raymond Delars, a small team of biologists, presented the city of Lausanne a comprehensive study intended to serve as a guide for designing specific objectives and conservation strategies for protecting urban biodiversity. The report includes an inventory of species belonging to past imaginaries. The disappearance of many species in the 20th century reflects the effects of urbanization. The most notable losses are in wetlands and lake shores, with the extinction of many highly specialized species that occupied biotopes that have now disappeared entirely. The first step in their diagnosis of the existing condition was to draw an inventory of target species, namely species under threat of being added to the list of the disappeared. Target species are generally rare organisms that are difficult to observe. In their words, the evolution of their population is often difficult to predict. We can hardly rely on their census, which is always random, to measure the state of health of the network or the effectiveness of measures taken. This is why we add to this target species a list of indicators, species that are more common and abundant, the monitoring of which will provide relevant information on the network and indirectly on the quality of its function. Proxy data is used to measure something that cannot be easily directly measured. In this case, the sighting of visible species can stand in for entirely different species. With these target species and indicators in mind, a collection of 6,000 precisely georeferenced, non-uniformly distributed fauna and flora data points were restructured into a matrix. Once compiled into GIS, this information was then used to characterize the biological content of the different sections of Lausanne's ecological network, consisting of 6 subnetworks, generated by grouping closely related habitats: open water, wetlands, forests, dry places, agricultural land, and built-up land. From these operations, a series of urban maps consisting of continuous colored brushstrokes of equal width, representing biological corridors for subnetworks emerged. A continuous line type was designated to the corridors that were to be uninterrupted, and a dotted line to those that would be supported through stepping stones. Streets and buildings were eliminated, colors were saturated, and each of the 6 subnetworks was assigned a color and a cute mascot when the map was made public in 2017 in the Urban Ecological Networks brochure to inform citizens about the importance of biodiversity and the ways in which they too could participate in its conservation. The latest version of these brushstrokes have been made their way into the official Plan Directeur Communal for 2030, published at the end of 2022, expressing vague intentions for integrating biodiversity as a factor in planning decisions. All subnetworks have been flattened into one layer in color named Ecological Network. The translucency of the layer shows the city fabric underneath, calling to mind many questions as to how this network will be resolved, given the numerous intersections with buildings, busy streets, and private property. The city's latest attempt to compute biodiversity, 123 Nature, is an open call for citizens to report sightings of 20 plants and animals, bioindicators that are easily recognizable by non-specialists and whose presence reflects the quality of green spaces. Perhaps this will fill the knowledge gap, given that 24% of the city hides away privately in privately owned gardens. The use of species as proxies is productive because they crystallize ecological dependencies and allow for predictions to take place despite uncertainties. There are 2 other case studies that I'm currently looking at to develop this line of thought on proxies, which I do not have time to go into today. One is the case study for using predictive model for studying the ecological properties of the city of Zurich. in which climate pollution, vegetation structure, and land cover are used as proxies for predicting distribution of biodiversity. And the other that navigates the scale of infrastructure to the most intimate corners of our human dwelling. Whereas the report that I discussed today accounts for urban biodiversity by placing the desirable or the emblematic target species as its compass. This publication ongoing exhibition at Palais des Rumines places the most despised urban creatures under the microscope. With this exhibit, I'd like to touch on another way of looking at the use of proxies that directly relates species to built environment. So not just using an indicator species for another species, but maybe thinking how a species such as a cockroach can be an indicator species for poor housing conditions in the city or other urban and architectural concerns. With that, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcela, for your recommendation. We will now invite the discussants for questions or comments.
Thank you. Fantastic topic. Really enjoyable presentation. Thank you. I wonder to what extent you take into account the interaction between the different species, because you have all these beautiful diagrams and statistics, but none of those species exist on its own, right?
Exactly.
Only in our diagrams and projections, but they're in the kind of their natural habitat. They constantly interacting, exchanging properties, or engaging kind of complex chemical cycles with other species, and how do you capture those internal dynamics? So that's my first question. And I also like the argument you had towards the end of how this ecological dynamics in the city are also closely entangled with urban dynamics, or the way we read the urban environment. So can you tell us a little bit more about the methodology you use to unpack those entanglements of urban and nature and
yes, no, thank you for your question. Actually, that's so I'm just beginning my second year, and that's why a lot of also your ideas along this. I bring up the points, planes, and proxies because that's the first thing that I start to worry about, is how to switch to the ties between species instead of just the species themselves. So this is why I'm trying to think of methods or ways in which I can bring this into our visual plane. So that's proxies, and these things I'm borrowing from other fields are ways in which I'd like to be able to then give this other layer, right, of meaning behind and context and interactions between other species. And so yes, and then the question about the built environment. So I read this in this publication, in this exhibition, they mentioned cockroaches as these indicators of poor housing conditions, and it just blew my mind because I was thinking, yes, okay, this could be the way in which now we talk about our environment, our way in which we consider species as part of the speaking about the visual parameter, the parameter to design for more inclusion or attract or repel. If we're going to attract or repel certain species, to do it in a much, yes, be able to integrate this into the way in which we design streets to houses to windows. Yeah.
Some of the first diagrams, so you started, one of the first slides was from the work of Design Earth, yeah, which is quite an interesting kind of visualization of this kind of internal dynamics or representation of this kind of interactions and cycles from within. And there's a lot going on in the field in terms of developing this kind of visualizations rather than the traditional top-down, cybernetic kind of visuals, which always portray nature as something passive, something that is a distance, something that we could eventually interact with if we wish, but which also end up reproducing this divide of human and non-human, which is exactly what you would like to overcome in the dissertation. So you need perhaps to take inspiration from some of these visuals and develop your own kind of inventive visuals of these dynamics.
Yes, right now I'm very much, that's a great, I would like that to be part of the production of exploring, not just depending on the digital twin, which is something that I'm involved in to model the flows, but other ways of visualizing those dynamics. Yes, thank you.
Thanks a lot for the presentation, Marcela. Very, very complex topic,
yes.
very interesting, but wow, this could go on for a very long time, which means you have a lot to choose from. No, it's super nice to see. I'm wondering, since it's the first time I see your work, I'm trying to understand a little bit what your plan, focus, intention is in the long run. And I know you're starting your second year, so it's more for me. And you might have explained it in your presentation, but boy, you talk really, really fast.
I know. I was looking at the time. I was like 10 minutes. Yes.
Like, wow. So, no, it's more like you know, is your intention to focus a lot on analyzing the current state and visualizing and bringing those to people's attentions and maybe creating a sensitivity for cohabitating, for designing and living with other species, or do you plan to move to some sort of design process suggestions? So is there,
yes.
Do you have that in mind on how we can change
think
that?
I'm really much more about bringing the topic to the architectural and urban design discourse. I'm going to include landscape architects too, but they're more familiar with this, yet still how we can begin to question the ways in which put up to question why we model the way we model, why do we visualize the way we visualize, and how does that help us or actually bring us further apart from thinking about these other species. I think that when you say whether I want to design, I'm a designer and it really pains me to have to not design, but at the same time, I think that most of the times when we talk about this, it's like a list of strategies, you know, make a house for insects, and you know, like so there's like, oh, make a roof garden or something. And it's actually, I think we need to move away from strategies that can be like on the checklist and think more holistically about how everything is working together. So that's why I try not to put my own, restrain the designer part and think more about designing the ways in which we see. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very nice to hear. Designers really love to put their finger.
I want to solve a problem.
That's super nice. The other thing I was wondering, and again, you might have been a lot more explicit about it than I perceived it. But do you start from the assumption that the more nature, the more other species coexist around our own built environment, the better? Or is there an evaluation analysis of what is good and bad, are really bad words, but do you evaluate, say, the advantages, or what's the desired? Where do we like, is the goal the more the better, the more interlacing between the species the better, or are there more levels to this?
Yeah, I think that there are more levels, right? I think I've perhaps started with those sort of more or less, or optimized with that. But actually, the more I look into it, I think it's about evaluating what are their needs for moving and propagation and this. And so that could be interlaced with ours, or maybe not at all, spatially, sectionally, but not necessarily that more trees is better. I think that that's something that we've been caught up in, or, you know, how to measure them in this way. So I think I try and stay away from because then that falls into the trap of being like, that's nature and we need more of nature, but actually we're all kind of, they're constructed and we're natural, and we're, you know, so we're all in a way the same. So that way I try not to talk to the different categories, or
Just a quick question. Thanks for the nice presentation. Following maybe on one of the previous one about visualization. So do you already have some ideas on how you want to visualize this? So it's just the drawings and maps, or you have other, I don't know, tools or ideas or media that you want to explore? You know, if you have thought about that, of course.
Yes. Okay. So the project, the digital twin project that is in the background of all of this is one way that should be visualized. And so it's a difficult question of visualization, because first of all, how do you make a project that's about biodiversity I mean, it's so complex and all this, but I would want there to be some way of creating this, if we're going to model synergistic relationships, so then there might be some way in which you can predict that there be a dynamic relationship that then you can change something and predict another. So there's this kind of representation that's more dynamic. But then I think that throughout the thesis, I'd like to create more sort of new ways of diagramming multi-scalar and multi-species representations. It might just be, you know, a 2D drawing like this. So I think I'm not exactly sure, but I'd like to find that voice soon to be able to guide. Illustrate the research while I go, not just talk about visualization. Right.
I just a quick add that I guess in that sense, it's maybe not just about how you visualize the data, but what the data really is. And you talked about that, but it's not just numbers of, say, certain animals that you see, numbers of trees. It's I don't know what it is, but like there's indeed so many levels to look at it that I think it could be really helpful to categorize that very clearly. Like what sort of data can you get? Is it numbers, points, locations? Is it areas? Is it time? Is it, I don't know, just thinking out loud, but
yeah,
that's
yeah.
It's typically, I guess, with other factors, like I'm thinking visual capital, right? It's pretty clear the type of data that you get. It's visual data to some extent, 3D modeling, but in your case, I think the relationships are so complex, and the information that you're working with is, interesting to talk about what the data is.
I think there's also this capturing the operations, like why would you make a map of where there are cockroaches in Lausanne was to exterminate them, and like just reviewing those relationships with other species to see like all the different modes in which we relate with others, and what are those tools, and maybe use them for other means, right?
We actually have some time.
Yes.
This is from the public, if you have any.
Very cool. You briefly mentioned using climate change, the temperature statistics.
Yeah.
So in the sense you have these population statistics for the various species as a time series. Is this mapped every year? And then if you could just talk about that.
Yeah, so that's not my study. That's someone else's that I'm currently trying to get an understanding for, and to see whether we can recreate that model for Lausanne. And so what was interesting to me was that they were using that pollution and climate data. You're talking about this one, right? Or no?
It could be.
Okay. That they've been using as proxies pollution, vegetation, land cover, and land cover structure, vegetation structure rather, as the proxies to indicate the urban quality. And so then from that to be able to say, okay, well, the distribution of, instead of, they have these sample points that they begin with in terms of all the different species that they've sampled or others have sampled, and then they can predict where those species are distributed in the city. And
how those populations will move as temperatures change?
I think that's definitely a question that they have in mind, because that's, yes, as they change, then certain habitats are not, they will have to be. Well, actually, that's another reason why to do this research is to move into something that's more predictive tool, because everything will change, right? And the fact that we're using, in the study that I presented today, they have like data points that someone sampled from like 1900, you know, like, and so why is this one sighting of this one species in this another century still holds so much weight today when climate is different, temperatures, everything has changed, right? A city grew out of nothing.
How difficult is it to obtain? Is it like a year-long process for this,
So,
for the
right.
canton of Zurich, or is it just like?
Gabriela and I just talked to these scientists last week, and I think from what I understood, it took a long time. Yes, we're like, let's recreate it for Lausanne, and they're like, right, that's going to take a very long time, because there are so. But as in your study, a lot of this data is available, and so luckily through the Blue City project, we have access to Lausanne and can ask for this necessary data set to try and do something similar. Now, also, I think Gabriela also mentioned, like, is it important to recreate this type of level model for this type of research as well? Like maybe there's something much more, a simpler model that is as important to do in order to be able to describe biodiversity for Lausanne, which doesn't have access to as much, you know, it doesn't have enough, as much attention as a large city as Zurich does. Right? Yeah.
Thank you, Marcela. Unless we have any other questions from you, can move on to the next presenter.
Yes,
sorry.
Yes.
Hi, thanks. Great presentation. I mean, maybe my question is really naive, but I was wondering if also what I find super interesting is that you're in between kind of super rational data, you show kind of maps and something that is very data intensive. And on the other hand, you're telling us that this has been a problem evaluating ecology when we're all reducing everything to kind of metrics and small metrics, and we're losing the big picture of very complex interconnected systems. So I mean, it's not really a question. Is I guess what I find really interesting is how you're trying to bridge those two levels in what you're saying, because that's what I feel like. On the one hand, a very kind of data-centric approach to urban ecology, and on the other hand, a necessity to kind of enter the question from a more synthetical that maybe, I don't know, landscape architects have, or because they didn't have access to the kind of computing power, but they were already doing ecology before accessing data intensive tools. So yeah, I find that this is kind of within your work super interesting to address.
Yeah, in fact, so yes, I definitely wanted to cover all those like unofficial or outside citizen sciences, all these that like are not, you know, because they add to our urban imaginary. In fact, some of them are much more influential in what decisions that are made in the city than, you know, scientists or someone in charge. So I think that that's what I'm really trying to discover, a framework that gives equal importance to all that multiple voices that are contributing to this big picture that we're creating. So yeah, if anyone has ideas, I guess, Apéro and stuff as to how to link those, or examples of other types of theses that have done that type of work, or books or research, that would be great. Thank you.